Founder FM. You're listening to Founder FM with your host, Graham Brown.
Hello and welcome to Founder FM, Voice of the Entrepreneur. Today I want to introduce you to a man who's been traveling the world to give you the best to find the information out there on equity crowdfunding. We're going to talk about why equity crowdfunding is important. If you're a startup, if you're looking to raise money, maybe you don't want to go through the traditional routes, or maybe you want to try out this new route, which opens up many opportunities for you, not just to get more cash, but also to incorporate marketing and the fundraising aspects together. We're going to talk about what equity crowdfunding is, and to do this, Nathan Rose is not just an expert on the subject, he's written a book on it. We're going to talk about his book in a minute. As I said, he's been traveling the world, 9 months out there, meeting all the players in the scene on equity crowdfunding. So if anybody knows what they're talking about, Nathan knows what he's talking about. Nathan, welcome to the show.
G'day, Graham. Thanks for that. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, you've been a busy man. You're in Thailand right now. You've been traveling hard for 9 months, doing the Airbnb thing, but in this time you've been out there talking to everybody and anybody in the equity crowdfunding scene. You're finding out what it's about. Let's sort of jump into the mix. We'll talk about equity crowdfunding and your book, because you've written this book about what it is. Okay, just let us understand, before we jump into the questions, what is equity crowdfunding first? For those people who haven't heard this word before, it's something which you're going to find more and more in the media, right? We hear it all the time now. Explain to me as if I don't know what I'm talking about.
So a lot of people would have heard of crowdfunding, the kind that you see on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. For those who don't know, that's where you put a page online and people donate or give you as a pre-order small amounts of money, which can add up to large amounts of money because it's done on the internet. And they're pre-ordering a product in many cases on Kickstarter. But equity crowdfunding is a little different. What you're giving away there is, instead of pre-ordered widgets or t-shirts or stickers or any of that junk, you're actually giving away shares in your business. So this allows a startup to raise a lot more money and gain a lot more engagement with their customer base, because they've got a real say in your financial success now.
Right, got it. So equity crowdfunding allows a startup of any shape and form to raise money in a lot easier way than through the traditional route. So we'll talk a little bit about the whys and wherefores of equity crowdfunding in a minute. But you've basically written a guide to equity crowdfunding for startups and growing companies, as we can see from the book. But I'm interested to know how you got into the space. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got into equity crowdfunding, because it's not something that's been around for a long time, is it? So tell us a little bit about your background and why you've chosen this area at the moment.
It was an intersection of a couple of changes in my life. So I started out my corporate career as an investment banker, which is pretty much the most horrible and draining thing that you can do. You're pretty much a grunt under the thumb of the guys above you, especially at first. But you do learn a lot. You learn about how to value a company. You learn about how to market a company to investors and how to manage an entire funding round. When I decided that I'd had enough of that and saw the guys above me who were super burned out and not really enjoying life too much, I thought, I've got to get out of this. I've got to start my own thing. But what can I do? I'm not a programmer. I'm not a designer. I have these skills in finance, and at the same time, I saw the emergence of this new thing, equity crowdfunding, which at the time was very new in New Zealand and still new in many parts of the world. So I saw equity crowdfunding emerging. I saw a need to grow a business, and the two just merged, really. So I was able to get some early clients, help them out to raise some money, and that's what's motivated me. Like, the more I've learned about it, the more excited I've become about the potential that this gives for startups and growing companies. Hence the book, and hence why I'm here today.
Excellent. Good. Well, I'm excited as well, because one of the things you talked about off air was this word disruptive. So let's sort of go a little bit into equity crowdfunding, because I think anybody who's in this space, and in this space I mean listeners to Founder FM. So we've got entrepreneurs of small startups. We have growing companies. We've got solo entrepreneurs as well who may be starting their first business. One of the reasons that people don't go down the avenue of raising finance is because A, it's a lot of hassle, and B, they don't obviously always get the best deal. Sometimes, I mean, you've worked in investment banking, you know that people can end up with a bum deal even though they're getting money for their business, right? But this sort of changes things a little bit. So if I could throw these questions at you now, equity crowdfunding, what is it, who's it for, and why do we need it? Let's start at the top so people can get an understanding of what this is all about.
You might be looking to raise, I'd say, 50,000 US dollars and up, and the maximum is going to be capped by law, but in most countries it's something like 1 or 2 million, or in the European Union, 5 million euros. So that's the kind of range of startups that's going to suit those who are at the stage where they've grown beyond the stage where they can fund it themselves, or where friends and family are just going to keep kicking in money, but not yet at the kind of later stage expansion rounds or IPO rounds. The money is within that range, but this has been a real gap for people, right? They're finding that banks won't lend money to them because they're too risky. VCs are increasingly getting into later and later stage companies and putting larger amounts into fewer companies. So this gap exists, and equity crowdfunding fills it nicely. As for who it's for, I mean, you said before that it's for startups of any shape or form, but I don't think that's quite right. I think you've got to have a scalable business, or a business which is easily understood. I mean, like my business, for example, where the skills of the founder are incredibly important to the business itself, couldn't raise funding this way. So you've got to have a systemized business, or a business which has got the potential to be systemized to raise money this way. And I think that's true of funding more generally. And as for why we need it, I think we touched on that this gap exists, and as well as the pain point of startups that couldn't get funding through VCs or through banks giving them a loan, it also offers a very interesting angle for even startups and growing companies that could have the option of getting VC money, but it's more of a marketing exercise, so you can get your word out to more people, and maybe you can get the deal done on better terms. You're really setting the terms in equity crowdfunding. You're saying, hey, here's what my valuation is. Here's the rights and preferences that we're going to attach to the deal. Who's interested? Rather than the traditional thing where a VC is going to like bargain you down on every point and really screw every last drop of blood out of you.
Right.
So, yeah, it has some really interesting applications to startups of many shapes and sizes.
So some key points there, Nathan. The figures that you threw out there were really important. Sort of, you said from 50,000 US up to, depending on where you're doing this, 2 million, for example, which is, I guess, is in the US, or 5 million in the EU. So that 50,000 starting point, below that, really, we're talking friends and family, aren't we? That's the sort of, savings, friends and family. Anything below that doesn't really work. It's not really worth your time going onto a crowdfunding platform. But let's say starting at the 50,000 point, well, that's kind of interesting, because I imagine a lot of entrepreneurs who have scalable businesses, they could have, be developing apps, they could have some kind of physical product or whatever. Yeah. They may need 50,000 and up. And in those situations, normally they wouldn't go to any kind of professional investor or an institutional investor, because it's just not worth their time, is it? They wouldn't even bother looking at these guys, right? Or, for example, if they went to one angel investor for $50,000, maybe that guy might have too much of a say in the business. So what are the sort of benefits? Why would a startup go to an equity crowdfunding platform for a small amount of money? I'm interested in sort of 50,000 to 100,000 US dollars. What would be the benefits in doing it that way?
Well, I think even more than the money in that case, they're getting that brand exposure, which startups at that stage are fighting tooth and nail for all the time. You can list yourself on the platform. You can get your company out there to literally thousands or even tens of thousands of investors if you use one of the larger platforms, and more people hear of you. And I can give you an example of this. There's a Canadian company called Gusto. They raised 50,000 Canadian dollars on a Canadian platform called Front Funder, and they got on board new customers, they got on board new suppliers. I think someone joined their board as a result of it. So getting their name out there was really the big benefit of the whole exercise. The money they needed too, but like talking to the founder, he was very clear that the benefit that he got out of it was much more on the exposure side than the money they raised.
There seems to be a lot of connection between the investors, if you can call them that, and the company, right? But then it's sort of on the institutional level. You have, I mean, one example I can relate to personally is I invested a small amount in a cycle retail outfit in the UK, and one of the things that they do is I regularly get emails, even though I'm not in the UK now, saying, you know, we're going to have an investors ride. So, you know, they'll get all their investors together and they go out for a ride on Sunday, right? So there seems to be a close connection. I can't imagine them doing that with VCs. That would never happen, right? Or even angel investors. So there seems to be a relationship there between crowdfunding investors and companies that doesn't exist anywhere else. Is that what you see elsewhere? Does that sort of, you know, is that a key part of it?
Well, angel investors and VCs go biking too. I mean, that's the new golf, isn't it? Riding bikes on the weekend. See these guys out there in their Lycra. Look, I think you're right. It definitely fosters a connection with more people. It's naturally going to be a weaker connection than any single one person who's going to be in your ear all the time, telling you how you should be running your business, which can be both a good and a bad thing. You know, it can change your culture in ways that you don't want it to, but they can also be a source of great and useful advice. But when you get, say, 100 people putting a small amount into your bike company, then yeah, you get this sense of community amongst people. And by the way, startups are normally having to pay to acquire customers, right? So if you can get people to put money into your company, you've got cash in the bank, and you haven't paid anything to acquire them, then that's a pretty attractive thing, especially for a startup that's just getting started.
Right. And these guys are also vocal fans as well. They go out and talk, like I've just told you this story, right? So people will be telling
everyone else over the internet, so it works.
Well, let's have a look at what else works as well. We've got a couple of case studies here, which from your book, which I thought were really interesting. I mean, you've got to go into the book to get more detail, but you can give us a top level here on these case studies. One which is a physical vehicle rent service, and the others which is an online education app, right? So let's talk about those because they're quite different vertical sectors. Let's start with this one. This is a Finnish company, EcoRent. What's the story here with crowdfunding?
They're interesting for a few reasons. One is that they combined their equity crowdfunding round with a reward. So when they went out and asked for money for people, they offered as well the chance to get 2 hours of driving time in their cars. So then your investors would get to try the thing out. They'd get to tell all their friends about it. Again, this network effect kicking in. And I think as well, they gave 5 hours of driving time to people who invested a larger amount. So you don't have to think of equity crowdfunding and rewards crowdfunding as being either or. You can actually do both at the same time. And they'd actually, before they'd even done this exercise, the equity crowdfunding round, they'd done a smaller rewards crowdfunding round, not with Kickstarter, but one of the local platforms which does a similar thing. So that way they got some practice at doing the whole exercise before they did their equity crowdfunding round. And I think this points to the normal direction that if you're going to do both, it's usually you'll get the reward crowdfunding round first to get some feedback from customers, get their input, raise a smaller amount, and then equity crowdfunding is going to be for larger amounts of money. And these guys were good at that, so they'd practiced it before. And the other thing,
just getting technical here, if I can just jump in. You talk about reward crowdfunding and equity crowdfunding. I think it's important to explore those are for people that are sort of maybe familiar but not quite up to date as you are. What are you talking about here?
Sure. So by rewards crowdfunding, I just mean Kickstarter and Indiegogo and sites like that.
Got it. All right. So what's the story with EcoRent? What did they do? They went in, they did the rewards crowdfunding, then they did the equity crowdfunding. And was it a success? What sort of things did they learn in the process?
It was successful. They raised their profile through the exercise, just like we were talking about earlier. I think one of the things that they learnt was that a lot of the money comes at the start of the offer and at the end of the offer, which does nothing for their nerves, because you see the campaign get some initial traction, and then the middle days are a bit slow and you feel like, oh man, we're not going to get there. But people leave things to the last minute, and we can talk later about some ways to encourage people not to do that, but effectively if people have the chance to wait, then they will. I mean, they did get there. And I think one of the reasons they got there too is that they've got this really nice socially sustainable angle about them. So it is true that equity crowdfunding and crowdfunding of all types actually will work better if your company's got something unique or more shareable about it. I think there is a trend out there that people want to use their money for the good of the world, right? They don't want to be investing so much in oil companies or fracking or weapons. They'd rather back this nice electric vehicle company, which is changing the world for the better, and they can have a direct connection that way. And
how much could you get on board with a project like this? What's sort of the entry point for an investment in EcoRent or a similar project?
Yeah, the specific number for this campaign, I'm not sure, but the typical numbers would be like €100 for an investor, but anywhere up from that. So there's usually no cap on the amount that an investor can put in. But at €100, you've got someone who hasn't just done this for fun. They've probably looked at it, and you don't just throw €100 away like that. They're engaged in your company, I think.
Excellent, fantastic. Okay, so EcoRent, they had a successful campaign. What was the sort of after effect of their crowdfunding campaign? Once they'd finished the campaign, did they have any tangible benefit that they could still measure in their marketing or in their whatever came afterwards that was as a benefit as a result of doing this?
Well, they could measure how many hours of the free hours that their new investors were using, and that would help them with their further outreach efforts. Like, they tailor their message slightly differently if they can see that the people have used the free hours versus not. They can encourage the people who have used them to tell their friends about it, for example. I mean, the obvious tangible example is the money, which they used to grow and expand their fleet and put their cars into more locations. But I think there was also like a lasting profile impact that had on their company, that because it was a fairly new thing in Finland at the time, they got press coverage, and those press relationships they could use on an ongoing basis. Like, once you know the right person to talk to, you can keep coming back to them with news. But I think, just doing a crowdfunding campaign by itself is not enough anymore. You've got to have some unique angle on it. So because this is like a local Finnish company creating electric cars, they were able to get play in the media, which not every campaign can.
Awesome. Let's move on to this one then. Tutora. Now, there's so many online tuition, online teaching, online education apps and websites out there. So I'm curious to know how this one, how the campaign with crowdfunding, Tutora, and also, how that sort of helped this website, this service stand out amongst the competition.
So these guys are a British company. Yeah, you're right. There seems to be a plethora now of like taxi apps and food delivery apps and ways to connect people with other people. And this is another one. I think their interesting angle is their on the ground presence. So they vet the tutors that come through with them, and there's a rating system, of course, so you can find the ones that are most suitable for you. I mean, what they're doing is they're helping high school students in most cases with their exams, with their study. Right. They raised a pretty small amount of money, but the cool thing that they were able to do was they didn't spend much money up front doing it. And we'll get onto this a bit later, but the reason that they were able to do their offer on an absolute shoestring budget, and as well they were very successful, like their offer closed in just a few short days, was they used their existing channels really effectively. They didn't spend any money on PR, so there's no cost there. They decided not to do a video, which I wouldn't usually advise because they did a good enough job of the other stuff. They were able to do that. And they were able to get what they call a lead investor on board before their offer started. This is I think, as well, maybe the distinction between what people first think when they think equity crowdfunding, that it's instead of angel or VC funding, but as well it can be done together. We all have one guy or one institution come in and put in a large amount of the initial raise, and that generates the momentum which is so critical to get the offer underway. Effectively, what you're trying to do with a crowdfunding campaign is show everyone that other people are interested, and momentum begets more momentum. If people visit your site and they can see there's $0 or £0 that's been contributed so far, then they're going to be really wary to be the first. What Tutora did is they found someone who said, yep, we found someone who will back us, and as a result, their existing customers and other people they knew were able to pile in, and they were done in just a few days.
That's a really interesting point, Nathan. So let's say, for example, you had an angel investor, a private investor, and you were in negotiation with them. One option that you've just put on the table here is that, rather than going direct with the angel investor, you could then get that investor to come on as a lead investor in a crowdfunded campaign, and that would create the momentum that would get, and also the social proof that would get a lot of other private investors, maybe at different levels, to come in afterwards, right? That's an option. Is that kind of what you're suggesting other companies can do here?
That is an option, and those additional investors could be the crowd putting in lots of small amounts of money, or it could be other angel investors. So the pain point for a lot of startups doing a fundraising round, especially if they're dealing with a number of different VCs or angel investors, is getting them to all agree to terms. Like, you'll get some who try to get preference over each other, or they'll try to renegotiate the valuation if they come in late, and the whole thing is just a pain in the neck. With crowdfunding, what you do is you find one lead investor, can be an angel or a VC. They set the terms, they set the valuation, and then the rest of the round can be filled up by either the crowd or by more angel investors, or whoever wants to put the money in, but it's done on those terms which were initially agreed.
Right, and that's a key point, isn't it? Because a lot of the private investors, maybe want to invest, but they don't have access to the information that maybe the lead investor has, right? Or they don't have, the relationships with the company and so on. So that lead investor can also do the due diligence really in the place of everybody else who doesn't have access, right? So that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, if you're putting in £100 or €100 or whatever, you're not going to be going through with a fine-tooth comb. So the thing you've got to do if you're one of these investors is look at who else has put in money already and rely on their expertise. Like in Tutora's case, I think they had a technology investor who had looked at these sorts of companies before, had gone on to successful exits. So the guys looking at putting in £100 could rely on their expertise to say, hey, they've actually got someone smart backing them, and I can come in too.
Excellent. All right, let's talk about questions, crowdfunding, the kind of questions that startup entrepreneurs, business owners may have about crowdfunding. Let's talk about cost. What are the costs involved in an equity crowdfunding campaign?
The costs you'll face are legal. You'll have a video to do if you want to do that. Some of these are optional, and some of them are essential. So I'm going to give you a range of actual numbers in a minute, but the legal I would count as being a compulsory cost. The video is an optional cost, but highly encouraged. If you have spend on social media, or if you need an accountant to help you through, it's basically going to come down to how much you can do yourself versus how much hand-holding you need by professionals. And people like lawyers and accountants are not cheap when you're paying them by the hour, so you've got to find ways to save money there if you're a startup, especially if you're a startup looking to raise money. So the range that I'll give is between almost nothing if you can do everything yourself and use the legal templates that the crowdfunding platforms will provide you and use your crowd to pile in. If your offer is really complex and you need some restructuring done before you will be allowed to go live, and you want to do a massive outreach campaign across many forms of media, and you want people to do this for you rather than your core team being involved, then the costs could get up to, I say, about $30,000, with an average maybe for the typical company of between $5,000 and $10,000. So that's a pretty wide range, and if you're a startup looking to get at the lower end, 50 grand, of course it doesn't make sense to spend 30 grand getting your offer ready, because you've also got a chance that your offer will fail, so you'll end up worse off than you started. So you should look at the cost as being commensurate with the amount of money you're trying to raise, and those are the things you need to think about.
Right. So the follow-on question, and I guess it's one of the most asked questions, and you just kind of alluded to it a little bit here, is can I do it alone, or do I need to go to one of these agencies? Because there seems to be a lot of companies now and consultants, individuals who are out there, helping companies do exactly what you just said. And it's something you also advise on yourself. Would a company need to go to an agency, and what circumstances would it be better for somebody to bring in help to run a crowdfunding campaign or to advise on it?
I think it makes sense when you're looking to raise larger amounts of money. And perhaps the cutoff point where it doesn't make sense to use an agency or lots of professionals to help you out with things would be around $300,000. If you're looking at raising more than that, then getting someone to help you with your overall strategy to drive that larger amount of money through the door can be worthwhile. But yeah, honestly, at smaller amounts, between 50 grand and 300 grand, you are better off doing things yourself, because, well, one, it should be easier because you've got a smaller amount to get through the door. And secondly, you don't want your costs to be too large compared to the amount of money that you're raising. I mean, agencies don't work on the basis of success. Like, you're not going to get your money back from the guy who shot your video if your offer's not a success. So you want to be using an agency who you've got confidence in, who knows what they're talking about, and has seen many offers before, and who you really back can help you, and as well have the skills that you and your company lack. So if you think that you have someone in your company that knows about early stage company valuation, then you don't need an agency to help you with that. Or if you've got a really strong marketing team, you don't need outside help with that either. So look for the skills you have, the skills you lack, and try to get outside help for the gaps that you've got.
If you were to go it alone, and I imagine a lot of entrepreneurs in that sort of lower range do decide to go it alone, outreach is something that you mentioned already. What exactly is that? Because I can imagine some entrepreneurs go into this thinking, all right, I've got an equity crowdfunding campaign, better load up buffer with my tweets now. That's my campaign. Is that all you need? Is it a few clever crafted tweets with the right hashtags? Is that kind of what you need to hit the big time with equity crowdfunding? Or are we in a different sort of ball game now?
I think you know the answer to that. Yeah, I mean, buffer hardly works for anything now because Twitter is just so overloaded with people putting out their own content. It's just a spam fest, right? When you're looking at getting this kind of money through the door, you've got to think about it from the investor's point of view. Like, if you were looking to invest in a company that you'd never heard of to the tune of 100 euros or 1,000 euros or more, then you're not going to do that if you see a social media share. And by the way, you can't really rely on the kind of explosive social media effect that you can kind of see sometimes in the Kickstarter and Indiegogo type world. Like, when Oculus Rift did their campaign, the first set of virtual reality headsets in the world virtually, they it was incredible, right? Like people were like, "Wow, virtual reality is actually here," so they were sharing it, and the money just came in through this. But with equity crowdfunding, people are more private about what they're investing in themselves. So, yeah, I think social media is not a complete waste of time, but certainly less effective than most people think. The ways that you're going to really get money through the door are through meeting people in person. Right? It sounds strange because you're doing this in an online platform, but you should be turning up to pitch evenings. You should be, if there's a large investor, you should go and meet them, shake their hand, let them know what you're all about. And you can do some of the outreach with the smaller investors through your video, but remember that one person putting in 100 grand is the same as 1,000 people putting in $100 each. So you want to spend your time with the people who can actually help your offer get to where it needs to go. And other things you can do. I mean, you should be providing an incentive to people to invest sooner than later because of that thing we talked about earlier, momentum. Most offers give absolutely no incentive whatsoever for their investors to invest on the first day or the first week. All of the incentive is there to leave it to as late as possible, and that's really bad for a campaign because it means no one else is going to see that social proof that you correctly pointed out before. So if you can give people perhaps a better reward, we talked about before, eco rent, 2 hours of driving time. Maybe you make it 6 hours of driving time if people invest in the first week, something like that, to encourage people to invest sooner than later.
Excellent. Great advice there. And I love your point about getting out there as well and going meeting people. Nothing can replace the value of that offline hustle in this online world, right? And so few entrepreneurs seem to be prepared to do that these days, that those that do that and get out there and shake the hands and do the presentations and turn up to pitch events, they're the ones who are winning in this era. So let's move on. Let's talk about the platforms involved, because we've kind of mentioned a few names already out there, but maybe you can sort of put us in the picture as to who the big players are and what kind of differences there are between these players that would be of note to an entrepreneur who's looking to go and get some crowdfunding. So just maybe start at the top. Who are the big players in the crowdfunding space, and what do I need to know in terms of how they differ and so on?
So the first thing you need to know is that as of right now, equity crowdfunding is very much nation by nation. You don't have the big global players like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, and that's down to the fact that offering shares through equity crowdfunding is an offer of securities. So it's regulated by the SEC in the US, it's regulated by the FCA in the UK, and as a result you end up with German crowdfunding platforms and New Zealand crowdfunding platforms. And so you can't point to one or two big global players. But nonetheless, let's talk about some of the big ones in the major countries that'll be of interest. There's WeFunder in the United States, and Republic are worth looking at. They're actually an offshoot from Angel's List. In the UK, there are three larger players. There's Seedrs, Crowdcube, and Syndicate Room. In each of the major European countries, there's one or two players. Like you could check out WeSeed in France, you could check out Componisto in Germany. And I don't want to go through literally every country in the world, but the starting point is to know that there's no single answer for every country in the world. So maybe just get onto Google and Google equity crowdfunding Australia or wherever you are, or wherever your company is incorporated, and that'll give you the answer to where to look. As for what the differences are, there are some really big differences. These crowdfunding platforms are all going to look very slick. They're all going to have a good landing page and a good social media presence. But you should be asking questions like, how much money have they actually raised? Because as a startup, you want to be in front of the largest audience possible. I mean, if it's just you bringing investors to their platform, then you've got to ask, what value are they really adding? I mean, yeah, they're hosting the video, they're hosting the payments infrastructure, but any platform can do that. What you really want to get is the benefit of their audience too. So people who haven't heard of you before can see your offer and become new customers that you haven't brought yourself.
Are there any types of companies that are doing well on specific platforms? I know you said it's very regional as well, but I imagine that there are certain types of companies which are in favor, maybe because there's already that type of company has exited already on that platform, so it makes sense now to back something of similar note. An example being that a brewery, there was a big case of, I think it was the Camden Brewery in the UK, which raised money on the crowdfunding platform and exited, and therefore every private label brewery out there was now on a crowdfunding platform trying to raise money, and a lot of them were getting successful because people saw the connection. Are there sort of trends at the moment in the crowdfunding scene? What are you seeing which may be of interest to a startup entrepreneur? You think, bing, yes, that's me, I'm in.
So a few things you said there. I do think that different platforms have different specialities. Some of them will be more into the consumer brands, like beer, and others will be more into like the really scalable, potential unicorn, fintech, medtech type businesses. So one thing when you're choosing a platform to do is to look at the types of successful raises that have been done and see if there's a match there. And that, by the way, is going to give you a good steer on how they did it. Maybe you can even reach out to them yourself. If you're a fellow entrepreneur, they're probably going to be all too happy to tell you how they did it and give you an hour of their time. Other trends that I'm seeing, I mean, I think there is a migration to for later stage businesses to use this as well. Like we used to, when equity crowdfunding started, the biggest pain point was for the really early stage startups who couldn't find funding any other way. But now that we've had some success stories about companies that could easily have gotten VC money but chose to do crowdfunding instead because of the marketing advantages and perhaps valuation advantages that we've already talked about, you're starting to see businesses say, well, hang on, maybe instead of getting a VC backing, I can do this instead. So that's a trend. Like even if you're not a startup or don't think of yourself as a startup, you can still use this to raise pretty large amounts of money.
Very interesting. Well, okay, let's go on to the key area where maybe some people come unstuck when it comes to crowdfunding platforms. Red flags. Where does it go wrong first? Maybe you can help people out here to avoid the avoidable mistakes. What are the main mistakes entrepreneurs make when they go onto crowdfunding platforms to raise money?
I love this question, Graham. I love this question because it's way better to learn from other people's mistakes than make your own. I mean, and I think the thing too with equity crowdfunding is that you get one shot at it. It's not like you run an unsuccessful social media campaign and you can just try again next week with something different. You really get one chance at it, and if you failed, it's going to be very hard to do it again. What are the traps? I think one is not giving enough time to it or thinking that it's going to be easy. And you see the video, you see the little page of copy on the website, and it looks so easy. It feels like you could knock all this together in a day or two. But actually the lead-in time to these offers can be 2 or 3 months or even more, because you've got to get accepted onto the platform. You've got to actually find the right platform, but even before that. So there's a job there. You've got to decide an evaluation and actually get comfortable with that. You've got to get all your marketing lined up before you launch. So that's one big thing, not giving it the time that it deserves. Another one is using the wrong platform, because the platform is going to be a partner with you throughout this whole journey. So think about your company culture. Like if you're let me just give an example here. There was a Swedish company that used crowdfunding, and they were into like natural organic snacks and beauty products. So they wouldn't want to go with a platform which was too corporate or too interlinked with VC, because they're all about being earthy and green. And yeah, so find one that you think you can work with, and it's going to be an intense process with difficult conversations. And like when you're choosing your valuation, actually put the time into that. Your company valuation is not how much money you need divided by how much of your company you're willing to give away. The calculation goes the other way. It's how much money do you need divided by what your valuation can reasonably be, and that's going to work out, what percentage of the equity you're going to give away. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs are a bit naive, and maybe this is why they're entrepreneurs, right? They're very optimistic and they see the hockey stick growth. And this is not unique to equity crowdfunding, but there is a tendency, I think, to say, well, because we can go out to the crowd is stupid and the crowd is just going to give us money, whatever valuation we choose. That's not true. The crowd is smarter than you think, and if you choose a high valuation more than you deserve, you probably will have a failed offer. So don't fall into that trap and do the work to work out what other successful campaigns have done at reasonable other stages of your business.
You mentioned about choosing the right platform. I know we talked a bit about it in the last question, but I'm curious, do platforms have their own lists of investors? It's not you could bring investors over to the platform from your network, but is the key here to tap their ready-made investors in their network? Is that sort of where the win is with using crowdfunding?
That's the win in using the right crowdfunding platform. So there will be crowdfunding platforms that have got what you just described, and there will be crowdfunding platforms that don't, where you've got to do the whole thing yourself. I think in both cases, even if they have an existing network, you're still going to have to bring the initial momentum and traction for their audience to even be interested. But just to throw some numbers around, maybe with a really big established platform with a large established audience, you can bring half of the money yourself, whether that's through angels or through your customers that you can get to chip in a little bit of money. And maybe the audience of the platform can fill out the rest.
Right. And it's sort of, I guess one of the things entrepreneurs could do if they're going onto a crowdfunding platform, and I'm sure this is something you've had experience from your investment banking background, is getting out there and having their own little roadshow, right? Is that sort of what used to happen in investment banking days, where somebody was raising money and they would get out and they'd have the roadshow in front of the investors, just whatever it is, just getting out there and just kind of going out and meeting people and getting the cards, getting the contacts. And I think that's sort of a red flag, isn't it? Entrepreneurs, they kind of, they think, I don't need to do this, and just kind of click away on the platform and get investors that way. But you've got to go out there and hustle, whether the platform has investors itself or whether you need to bring them across from your own network. Whatever happens, I think this is from the startup manual, isn't it? They said there's no answers inside your own office, and you've got to get out there, and you've got to get out there and meet people and shake hands and do all that kind of stuff. Even though this is an online business, success is all offline here.
It's the advice that no startup likes to hear, but you still got to give it. I mean, back to my own story, I've spent 9 months flying around Canada, the US, all through Europe. I'm in Southeast Asia now. I'm from New Zealand. I went to Australia too. So, to build my business, that's what it took. I think you don't have to do that, but you also can't treat this crowdfunding exercise as a video game, which you can, just do from the comfort of your co-working space. Yeah, go meet people, go see what the objections are, and you can, if you do that, you can actually work out whether your campaign will be a success or a failure before you launch, right? So you should actually know, in an ideal world, who's going to put the money in before you even go public with it, and that way you don't even risk having a public failure.
Great advice. That's great idea validation, getting out there into the real world, into the analog world, and testing your ideas by seeing if people are actually interested in what you've got to offer before you put it onto the crowdfunding platform. Hey, this has been a really interesting chat with Nathan Rose about equity crowdfunding. He is the author of The Complete Guide for Startups and Growing Companies, Equity Crowdfunding. Nathan, I'm going to ask you a little bit where we can get hold of your book, but it seems to me that if I was interested in this area, and it's a long journey, right? I mean, I'm not just going to go onto the crowdfunding platform and start my campaign now. You talk about long lead times, there's all the due diligence, there's the acceptance and so on. It seems to me a good starting point is to get hold of a copy of this book, right? Because that will give you the step one, the foothold into equity crowdfunding, and help you also avoid some of the mistakes that could be quite costly. As Nathan says, this isn't like running a social media campaign. Sometimes you might only get one shot at this. If you go onto an equity crowdfunding platform and you run a campaign and it's a flop, you might have burned a lot of your goodwill matches that you might not be able to then go and do it somewhere else with a different bunch of people. So, you want to get this right. You want to line up all your ducks before you go onto that platform first. Check out Nathan's book, because I'm sure there's a lot of advice in there to help you do that. Nathan, where do we get hold of a copy of your book?
If you just search for it on Amazon, it'll pop right up as the first result. Search equity crowdfunding. Or you can go to my site, which is assembleadvisory.com/book, and that'll have the links to it too, if you prefer. And it's available in Kindle, it's available in paperback, and it'll soon be available in audiobook too. So any format you like, you can get the tips from all around the world.
Fantastic. Well, we've been talking about how to become a successful entrepreneur by raising equity crowdfunding today. If you want to find out more about becoming a successful entrepreneur, go and check out Up.School.io/start. Free videos there if you want to get a foothold, if you're launching your business, growing a business. Hey, and if you also want to raise some money for that business, you want to go and talk to Nathan, because get a hold of a copy of his book. I'm sure he'd be happy if you reached out to him as well. Go and check out his website, because he does also advise startups. So that's an option as well. We'll put all the details in the show notes. And if you're watching this on video on YouTube, we'll put it in the description below. This is Founder FM, everybody, voice of the entrepreneur over at Up.School. My name's Graham Brown. You've been listening to Nathan Rose and how to raise money by equity crowdfunding. World traveler, author, startup advisor. He's on his travels as well. He's in Thailand at the moment. So if you are in Thailand, give him a shout. But he's heading off again. That's the whole thing with this lifestyle. Never settles down anywhere, moving around. He's got to go and meet some other equity crowdfunders somewhere in the world. Where are you going next, and what's the sort of the next 6 months going to look like for you, Nathan? Are you still traveling? Are you settling down? Are you still got the itch to get out there and visit more countries, visit more people?
Yeah, the next little while I'll be back in the homeland, back to New Zealand for Christmas. And after that, I'm going to be back to Europe for a time. I'm looking to spend some time in Estonia, which is a little Baltic country just south of Finland and west of Russia. A very interesting place for fintech, and the next few months I'm going to be building out my range of books, because after launching my first one, I've gotten interested and hooked on the whole rush as an author of launching and getting products out there that provide residual and passive income. So yeah, there's going to be more travel, there's going to be more books, and there's going to be more fun. So thanks for having me, Graham. It's been great.
Founder FM, voice of the entrepreneur. Find out more at www.founderfm.com.